Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar titled Roadmap to Operationalizing Precision Medicine, presented by Healthcare Informatics. My name is Rajiv Leventhal, Managing Editor of Healthcare Informatics. Today's program is sponsored by Deloitte Consulting, LLP. Thank you to our sponsor and to our audience for giving us your time and attention today. Before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping details to go over. First, to submit a question or a technical issue, please use the Q&A area below the slides at any time. You do not have to wait until the end of the program to do so. To download a copy of the presentation, please click the link in the Resources tab to the right of your slide. Finally, join our webinar conversation on Twitter today, and you can do that by tweeting using the hashtag #HITLiveWebinar. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's program. First, Dr. Fred Lee is a physician executive at Deloitte and has helped drive the emergence of personalized and precision medicine throughout his career in various roles, having led market strategy and EHR product strategy efforts for several large technology firms in the U.S. and in the UK. At Deloitte, he focuses on working with clients from the provider, life sciences, biotech, and technology sectors on their strategies in the domain of precision medicine. We also have Dr. Bill Farah, who is a principal at Deloitte and has provided over 2 decades of clinical and information technology leadership at academic, community, and ambulatory medical centers. And he has consistently worked to redefine the model of healthcare delivery through deployment of state-of-the-art information technologies to produce superb clinical and financial outcomes. Thank you so much, Drs. Lee and Farah, for taking the time to speak with us today. And with that, the audience is yours.
Great. Thanks very much. So thanks for joining us today. And very quickly, there's some objectives we'd like to accomplish. First and foremost, we'd just like to share our understanding of the current market and the really recent explosion and growth of precision medicine programs as service lines and interests across the spectrum of providers. We'd also like to then explore observations in that space and the state of that space and the maturity of it. And then finally, we're going to review how we've been able to help some of our clients in establishing and executing upon their precision medicine strategies. So if we just start as a level setting and just looking at some of the trends as we see them in precision medicine, we do see, as we've said, that the market really is exploding. And even just a recent survey by Healthcare Informatics showed that in October showed that over 60% of providers have this as a very high priority. And only a few say that it's not a priority at all. And that's a dramatic increase from recently. We're seeing an explosion of conferences and really this evolving space very quickly. And along with that, we are seeing challenges in implementation. We're seeing that clients and organizations are all starting from a different point in terms of their people, process, data, technology, environment, understanding, and where they want to focus their efforts. And workflows are highly variable, not only between institutions, but within institutions. And sustainability of the service line continues to be a very complex issue. Similar to when electronic medical records started, we have a number of vendors that have emerged, but it's difficult to find a comprehensive end-to-end solution that really accommodates all aspects of workflow. And so that begets another issue of systems integration. And we see that clients are really looking for help in this capacity and really understanding how to bring these systems together to talk to each other in a way that does promote workflow at the patient interface. And so in concert with that, we're seeing that solution vendors are expressing an interest in developing in-market partnerships to jointly serve provider clients and start to provide that more end-to-end type of an experience for the user that allows them to interact with their patients in a natural way. And so, when we look at the market, when we talk to clients, what we're trying to help them with and what we feel like our clients are struggling with is really putting a fine point on what it is that they're trying to accomplish, both from a physician standpoint and a patient standpoint. What is their definition of precision medicine and how they want to develop their own programs? Once they understand what they're trying to accomplish, how exactly do they create a sustainable program, both from a regulatory standpoint as well as from a scale standpoint across their enterprise? We see that a lot of clients have started in a hematology oncology space, and that's a natural starting point. But how do they really start to scale across their overall enterprise and bring all entities and stakeholders in the organization on board? And then as they do that, organizations are really trying to understand the entire ecosystem of vendors out there, what their peer groups are doing, what the vendor peer groups are doing, and how they can go across the sector to partner to create a solution that makes sense from an end-to-end way. So with that, Fred, if you wanted to just walk through a case study to understand how this space is evolving, that'd be helpful.
Great. Thank you, Bill. So, as Bill had mentioned, for providers, understanding what precision medicine means from an operational perspective is the first and fundamentally important step overall. And so if you consider precision medicine to be, a balance and a blend between care delivery, research, discovery, and drug development, all of those kind of the automated and scalable workflows between those capabilities, then providers have to understand and make the decisions about how they're going to play in those dimensions when they're standing up a regulatory compliant precision medicine service line itself. So here at Deloitte, we kind of use this example of what it means to have delivery, discovery, and drug development twined together. So in this case, Dr. David Carbone, an oncologist from Vanderbilt and Ohio State University, published a paper several years back looking at non-small cell lung cancer and targeted therapies. In this case, it was a kinase inhibitor, sorafenib. So pharma had launched a trial around sorafenib in lung cancer patients, the ECOG 2501 trial. In this, 300 patients with lung cancer were enrolled, but only 9 of them showed response to sorafenib, the therapy that was being investigated in the trial. So initially, pharma looked at that and said, well, that was good. It was a failed trial. We didn't get the broad responses that we were looking for in terms of sample size itself. But Carbone's group took a look at that study, and they saw, okay, there were 9 responders. But if they analyzed those responders, one of those was a woman who was a super responder. So she enrolled into the trial with severely advanced lung cancer. Obviously, the prognostic, indications are very poor at stage 4, those advanced cases themselves. On a trial, she was actually able to achieve 5 years of disease-free survival on sorafenib. So they dove a little deeper into that case and tried to understand what was going on there. So Carbone's group looked at a lot of genome sequencing data and RNA sequencing data that was associated with the patient case. They had identified that a novel mutation in the patient's tumor, ARAF, was identified. Now, to date, at that time, ARAF had not been associated previously with this type of lung cancer itself. So they did a little bit more investigation from in vitro, in vivo, and informatics analysis. And they tested the informatics databases related to cancer. They did see that, hey, in small cases, ARAF does show up. So it could potentially be a driver mutation. Then they went to the bench to try to understand the biological plausibility of how that mutation in ARAF could trigger non-small cell lung cancer. And their validation studies came back with plausible mechanisms for that. So in this case, they were able to identify a new driver mutation that had not previously been associated with lung cancer. And then again, churn through the informatics and the bench science to validate that itself. Now, a couple takeaways from this. So obviously, this was all done retrospectively. So even though the patient had achieved 5 years of disease-free survival, they eventually succumbed to their disease eventually. So rather than, we want to be able to do precision medicine in real time and in a prospective fashion to be able to get better outcomes and better survival for the patients themselves. Second key takeaway is that there was massive amount of manual work to get this done in terms of churning through the bioinformatics and the informatics databases and the bench science itself. So being able to create scalable and automated solutions enable this to leave the lab and get to the point of care is a critical piece. But the problem is it's going to require this intricate ballet between care delivery, research discovery, and then drug development going forward, which we'll explain a little bit further in the next slides.
Yeah, and I think, Fred, when you think about this as a window to therapeutic and patient matching, it's a great use case and really highlights the importance and where we are from an inflection standpoint as a profession of how we really start to pinpoint different therapies for specific patients. And as we said at the beginning, well beyond oncology at this point, we're looking at markers for behavioral health and response to pharmacologic agents, depending on the patient profile and genetic profile in that space. I think most people know at this point about Plavix sensitivities after stem placement, asthma and COPD, and different patients' response based, again, on genetic markers and profiles. So this idea of therapeutic matching that really became prevalent and of great importance in oncology is certainly spreading to other walks of medical fields and is becoming mainstream in terms of how we take that genetic information and match it from a therapeutic class standpoint to most effectively treating disease progression. So I think it's a great case study and shows how this idea of therapeutic matching is really becoming mainstream.
Yeah, absolutely. And, having walked in this space for many years, I'm just happy to have lived this long for us to see, some of the promise become reality itself. But Bill mentioned a couple of very important things there. So number one, really the standard of care, particularly in oncology and when you fail first-line cancer therapy, heavily revolves around using genomics to find molecular targeted therapies for that oncology case. Now, I want to take one step to the side here with some caveats. So the definition of precision medicine that was promulgated by a study group from the National Research Council in the paper listed here really defines precision medicine not just from a genomic and clinical data perspective. Today, we're heavily focused on that genome-phenome axis related to the data and heavily invested in oncology as a disease area. But the true definition underlying this is that it is analyzing data at multiple length scales in the hierarchy. The phenome and the genome is where we're focused on today, but there are other modalities related to looking at the epigenome. What are the methylation markers that are going on to the structural changes in the genome itself as opposed to just variants in your genomic code overall. The microbiome. Each and every one of us is actually a commensal organism of not only your own human genome, but the genomes of about 3,500 bacterial species themselves. So we're starting to understand that interplay between our own biologic state and the biologic state of those microbiota that co-survive with us. Obviously, the epigenome, proteins, but then you start really going, not zooming down the length scale, but zooming up. So when you start looking at environmental exposures and the exposome itself, looking at populations, These are all the length scales that precision medicine will cross and go across going forward. So the two takeaways from this really are caveat number one, you can easily paint yourself into a corner if you establish a strategy that only considers oncology and only considers genomics going forward. And that's an important takeaway when you start thinking about what are the reference architectures that establish this, that will support these service lines themselves as they become reality and standard of care has changed. Okay, so let's talk about some of the key operational considerations that providers have to address, think about when they're formulating their strategies themselves. Some of the highlights are listed out in red here. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but some of these are very important. So we just talked about strategic framing. If you're an academic medical center, then you're clearly going to be interested in not only care delivery, but research discovery at full strength and drug development in terms of clinical trial programs in a very robust fashion. If you are a community hospital or an integrated delivery network, your strategic framing and operational definition of precision medicine will differ. You may have to, be dialing down the research discovery, and you may have a clinical trials program that you want to grow further. But clearly, your focus is going to be more around delivery itself. Now, that doesn't mean, however, that the mid-market should ignore discovery and drug development, because what we're seeing is that there's a lot of partnerships that are emerging for capabilities within sectors, between academic medical centers and IDNs and community hospitals, and even across sectors between biotech, life sciences, and providers themselves. So that really brings to the second strategic feature operational consideration, your network of networks strategies. So again, very rarely are you going to have all the capabilities in-house, internal to your organization. You're going to need to figure out what are the right partnerships to support your operational definition of precision medicine. Now, the close cousin to the network of network strategies is the sustainability strategy. So if you stand up these precision medicine service lines, reimbursement will only take you so far. Hardcore dollar investments will only take you so far. What you really need to also consider and tap into are the cross-sector investments that are emerging around this. As life sciences and pharma has really understood what the value of real-world evidence and clinical data is, they have started to really execute on strategies and invest in working with data aggregators, providers, patient groups themselves about how to transact on that data itself. So, again, critical feature, and we'll talk about that in terms of how you put these pieces together. The one other point I want to have on this slide is that if you consider how do you mobilize and operationalize precision medicine from the top down, here's the key things to think about. But what often ends up happening is that providers will approach us because one of these boxes will light up. So, for example, we have experienced work with integrated delivery networks that are saying, look, our pharmacy spend on oncology is going through the roof. Can you help us understand how to analyze and control that in some capacity? Now, the reality is, what's the driver for that pharmacy spend going through the roof? It's these targeted molecular therapies, which cost $300,000 a year. And so, they kind of need to think about that. But that's, again, an example of a health system reacting to an outcome of precision medicine because it's become the standard of care, and then realizing they have to back into a strategy going forward. Okay. So not only are those that matrix of considerations important, but these are hot topics that we're coming across in the last 6 months that come over and over again. So participating in data sharing efforts, that is directly linked to the networks of network strategy. There are so many of these options available. Sometimes it's very hard for health systems and providers to understand apples and oranges and whether the difference is there and what's the value of participating in one data sharing effort versus another one. Likewise, and we alluded to this earlier, precision medicine beyond genomics. So this is manifesting in a couple ways. Even in cancer therapy, today the portfolio of therapeutics is heavily focused around targeted molecular therapy. If you have this variant, here's a drug that targets that to be able to achieve the outcomes themselves. But there's new therapeutic modalities coming online, related to immunotherapy, really harnessing the body's native immune system to go after cancer cells themselves. Checkpoint inhibitors, are another example of this as well. The reason why I bring those up is that the workflows associated with delivery, next-gen sequencing, and trial development are actually very different in some cases between those therapeutic modalities. So again, you have to consider how the evolution of precision medicine is growing before you paint yourself into a corner. Imaging data is a big substrate where people are trying to harness and understand how do we use the radiology data as deeper characterizations of the clinical states. But there's also very different insights that can be achieved, from the uses of imaging itself. So you think about that, that's a very different technical architecture to be able to support a precision medicine service line to harness imaging data itself. And then finally, EHR integration, right? At the end of the day, there is a patient encounter. That patient encounter is supported by an electronic health record. And so how do we close the loop and get back into the EHR with the decision support that we have created around helping this patient in this encounter for that provider itself.
Yeah, and I think, Fred, putting on my primary care hat, I think this is something that is of great concern to a lot of our clients in terms of workflow. And you talked about the storage considerations. And we have massive storage needs when you think about people's genetic profile, and then you start to think about that with imaging. And I think there's a good corollary, too. When you think about imaging, we don't want to store every image in an electronic medical record, but we need to have access to those images sometimes. And we want to have some decision support associated with those images if possible. I think similarly with precision medicine, and now we have patients driving some of this, right, where they're getting their genomic profile done in a private setting and bringing it into physicians and saying, I need you to help me interpret this, and what am I going to do with this? And we're constantly discovering new markers and new indicators. And so having a way to store this information that interacts with our electronic medical record and can provide decision support without crippling the systems from a transactional standpoint is a real challenge and takes some nuance in terms of thinking about the architecture and the way that we set this up so that we're able to satisfy patient demands, we're able to take care of patients in real time, and we're able to get that decision support that's helping us to make informed decisions about what medications people need to be on, what medications may be interacting in ways that we did not anticipate, and what other tests should we be thinking about for our patients based on the different disease profiles that they may have and their genetic markers. So all of those things to come together at the interface of really consumerism and advanced basic science, which is fascinating.
Yeah, no, great point, Bill. Getting this back to the reality of the patient encounter, the patient's journey, and their, the outcomes going forward. That's the, kind of final frontier to this, and obviously lots of interesting technical approaches towards that overall. So, okay, so we wanted to talk about an understanding of, kind of how we have helped clients in the space overall, both in the what, the how, but also with the with whom in terms of how you need to move forward on a precision medicine strategy itself. So typically, a health system client will have kind of three avenues in to this path. So avenue number one, they have rationally said, we need to start to create enterprise scalable level approaches and solutioning to stand up and support precision medicine service lines. So that's the kind of top-down. The C-suite says this is a strategic priority. We have to get ahead of it. Let's get moving on that. That's type one. Type two is, the organization that has seeded a pilot in precision medicine, whether they've used hard dollar investment by themselves, grant funding in some capacity, and been able to establish a successful pilot in some capacity. But then the challenge of, okay, well, how do we blow more air into this balloon, lift it to the enterprise level in terms of precision medicine service line, is regulatory compliant and scalable. We need to understand how to connect the dots from that successful pilot going forward. The third class of providers that approach us, it's kind of a subset of the second, but what happens is that a vendor solution typically will come in, will work with a champion within the health system. That could be a molecular pathologist, it could be an oncologist, et cetera. And they said, look, we've stood up a tumor board around a specific disease area, but what we need help with is really communicating to the C-suite about what precision medicine is, how do we operationalize around it, and then how do we scale from this successful pilot itself. So again, these roadmaps really help educate those key stakeholders at a leadership level, operationally in terms of how do you stand up the program and the technical reference architecture to be able to address that in terms of the how, and then the with whom in terms of who are the right vendors and capability partners that you need to be brought together around this. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to show how precision medicine workflows are emerging and the intricate ballet between delivery, discovery, and drug development, and what are some of those implications overall. So these are roadmaps that we will build with clients based upon their operational definition of precision medicine, and we'll build these in informatics, in talent and capabilities, in change management, and regulatory compliance. So the base construct, again, it focuses on care delivery occurring. Patients are encountered. We'll use oncology as an example. Failed first-line cancer patients. The biospecimen is captured. Sequencing occurs on that. So the care delivery arm and the central genome sequencing, CLIA compliant diagnostic precision medicine service line is established. So the clinical data is captured, the molecular data is captured, and then that's put into a precision medicine knowledge repository. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Where research discovery comes into play is during the investigation here, has a new variant been found in some capacity? If it's a new variant that hasn't been reported before, then that's when you can enact a research discovery arm, just like we talked about with the David Carbone example, to look at informatics, biologic plausibility, in vivo, in vitro models, and then harvest some new knowledge about the patient case itself. That gets into the reference knowledge ecosystem via publication, curation of those outcomes, and again, gets into the kind of the central knowledge repository. Going forward, that information will be accumulated typically by a molecular tumor board to review the case, or a diagnostic review board. If there's a match between the molecular profile, the clinical case, and potential therapeutics, then often you have to enroll, there's the opportunity to enroll that patient into a clinical trial, whether it's to gain access to experimental therapeutics, or because the organization wants to establish a late-stage observational trial going forward. There are other elements where these workflows link primarily around closing the loop. So you've established the tumor board's recommendation around a therapeutic, but what you want to really do is capture the outcomes to see exactly what happened with that patient journey, and do that in a continual fashion itself. And then obviously, kind of contributing the knowledge in and around your network of networks is an important piece. So let's look at the same construct, but in terms of the informatics capabilities needed to support this overall. So on the care delivery arm, obviously your electronic health record is going to be the source for a lot of the clinical encounter data. Your enterprise data warehouse will help aggregate some of that data itself. And then a data curation pipeline really from the tumor board recommendation and the treatment protocol, but then capturing what happens with that patient going forward, some of the important informatic constructs on the delivery arm. For the central precision medicine service line, again, obviously there's blocking and tackling things like a CAP-compliant biospecimens in terms of a lab information system, having your next-gen sequencing pipeline or targeted CLIA panels themselves, secure storage of the data in HIPAA, FISMA-compliant platforms. Cloud solutions have come online for that. And all of these capabilities, themselves in terms of the bioinformatics, the pathology workbench that can capture not only your internal CLIA pipeline data, but also data from send-out reference labs at the raw stage. All of that culminating in the tumor board application itself. And then obviously if you are enacting from a discovery and a drug development perspective, having your research data warehouse, your research tooling, but also the transactional tools for running clinical trials in terms of CTMS and electronic data capture systems become an important piece.
So I think Fred,
finally,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Fred. Finish.
Yeah, and then finally, last thing here is the reference knowledge ecosystem itself. So there's a lot of analysis which is leveraging machine learning and cognitive tools coming forward here. So, Bill, I'm sorry, you had a comment?
No, I was just going to say, and that was actually a perfect transition. You've introduced a lot of things that up till now I would say have been buzzwords, right? This is really where big data and new IT comes alive, right? This is the window to the transition to the big data universe. This is really where you do need to start thinking about cloud computing. This is where advanced analytics and machine learning is the rubber meets the road, and this is real life applications, and people are really doing this. You start layering in concepts of deep learning, and some aspects of AI start to come to the surface. And you've mentioned this a few times, this network of networks concept and the ability of systems to talk to each other more seamlessly really, again, highlights the need and the maturity of interoperability. So I think, some of these concepts and the reason why I think that this field is really becoming so important and so top of mind for folks is that these things that have been concepts have really started to become reality. And we're moving past proof of concept into application, and people are moving past the fear of cloud and accepting that as the new reality. And big data manipulation with machine learning is becoming real, and people are being successful with it, and it's really jump-starting this new approach to IT enabling clinical medicine and discovery. So I think this is an extremely important slide, and it speaks to a lot of the newer techniques in IT that people are starting to embrace in the provider universe.
Yeah, now, and to the audience, apologize for some of the density of the slide itself, but I mean, this is really where you're getting down to understanding the context of why some of the investments need to be made. You will have many of these assets in place already, but this provides you the workflow and the strategic narrative about how all these come together. And again, if you think about care delivery, discovery, and drug development, we're all wrapped around a central precision medicine diagnostic line. That's 4 or 5 regulatory code sets that you have to traverse to be able to successfully, launch these types of service lines themselves. So the fact that we're getting down and rolling up the sleeves and talking about how do you put these Lego pieces together now is, again, a very, very interesting piece. And not even considering what are some of the vendor solutions that you have to consider in each one of these boxes going forward. So as an example of that, and also an example of how we kind of have been helping clients, if we double-click the Tumor Board app capability, we will help clients with the evaluation system selection of applications that support the molecular tumor board. And again, at a high level, here's the key inputs, the key functional requirements, but also what are some of the considerations related to the workflow linkages that have to happen between delivery, discovery, and drug development going forward. And then if you double-click on any one of these lozenges, then we can, discuss the technical and the functional requirements going on overall. So again, in the spirit of giving the audience a sense of, number one, the detailed granularity of the path that clients have to walk through to successfully operationalize precision medicine service lines, but also how we're helping them sift through, all of the decisions that have to be made here going forward. Okay, so again, zooming back up at a high level, client work that we've done really starts with strategic framing, defining the what precision medicine means to you from an operational perspective. The next steps really focus on both the sustainability, but also the capability that you want, the capability mix that you want to bring to the market around precision medicine. Those are going to then generate, where from a sustainability strategy, the context of who are the data share partnerships that you want to get involved in, understand, explore further. All of those will then be determinants for your reference architecture in terms of how you stand this up from an informatics perspective going forward. Then you're able to really layer in who are your technology partners, and also on the capability side, who are your capability partners that you need to engage to fill in some of the gaps related to your definition of precision medicine itself. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Fred and Bill, for a really informative presentation. We've already had some questions come in from the audience, but just like to take this time to remind you guys to use the Q&A area below the slides, and you can do that to submit a question at any time. And also, as a reminder, you can download the slide deck in the Resources tab to the right of your presentation window. We do have a few questions already. And first question from the audience: what are the biggest challenges to getting a precision medicine program off the ground and up and running?
Yeah, Bill, you want to start off and I can add some commentary there?
Yeah, I think that a couple things. So first and foremost, I think it depends on if an organization has already started in one area, and then a challenge becomes how to scale the approach that may have started usually in oncology, and how do we scale that then to the rest of the organization. As we start to think about the scaling, and Fred alluded to a lot of the issues with compliance and regulatory, making sure that we have that robust process in place to address those issues. But then we alluded to the informatics challenges, and making sure that you have the right network of networks, that you have the right infrastructure, that you have the ability to scale from an informatics standpoint, from a data storage standpoint, and then that you're able to create a strategy that allows your transactional systems, like your electronic medical record, to interact with more of your, for lack of a better word, your more storage-oriented systems. So creating that solution architecture that incorporates those big boulders, I would say, in terms of getting right, are usually where we see clients struggling to get started. For those that have not started at all, it's really understanding where is the first place that I can get a win, that I can build a program around and expand. But at least those people who are starting from scratch can take an enterprise view from the beginning. Fred, is there anything you would add to that?
No, I think that's right. I think in 2018, clients are coming to the table already with the why. Well, they've already gone past the should we. They need help with defining the why and what we're going to do around this. And really the biggest challenge now for those clients is it's such a complex issue. It's the how do we start to tackle, address, and really start to execute on strategies around this, like you said, Bill. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Next question from the audience. You guys mentioned that precision medicine is becoming a priority in healthcare organizations, pointing to a survey. But how would you quantify organizations' level of sophistication right now in these types of initiatives? Would you say they're more immature, somewhat mature, or sophisticated and mature?
So, yeah, that actually brings up a very good question. So as we're getting more and more experience with kind of the starting point for clients as they try to figure out the precision medicine journey, we're working with several academic institutions to build out a capability matrix kind of maturity model in the space itself. To answer the question itself, though, often you find that organizations are actually a little bit more mature than they realize when it comes to this. And again, the main driver around this is in cancer, in oncology, in failed first-line cancer therapy, the standard of care is to enact a precision medicine workflow. So that having been said, there are elements of this already occurring, but then how do they scale that up across other disease areas? How do they then start to really participate in, frankly, the precision medicine economy that's emerging around this, are kind of the two key lifts themselves. So I wouldn't characterize it as, well, you are technically immature and you shouldn't try to do this. But in 2018, there are ways to address the capabilities that you don't have today, which, frankly, did not exist as solidly 2 years ago. The number of vended solutions that are starting to play in this space, the number of technology investments that are starting into this space, and frankly, the controlled collaboration models between providers, and peers, and across sectors. I mean, all of these tracks have been laid, and so it's a matter of, again, how do you operationalize against that more than anything else?
Yeah, well said. Next question from the audience. Do you have any thoughts on the government's precision medicine initiative project that it founded, I believe it was last year? And if so, where do you see that initiative going in terms of progress made so far and future endeavors?
Yeah, so I'll start with this one, and Bill, you can chime in on commentary. So obviously, NIH and NCI, their initiatives around what was originally called the Precision Medicine Initiative, but now has been rebranded as All for Us, I think is a very important piece to show what some of the elements around having a scalable program that engages the patients and in different dimensions are going to show. So as an exemplar, in and of itself. I think it's going to be important. I think that the program probably also represents, an example where the government has kind of stood in and said, here is a experience around standing up a program that will help catalyze further proliferation of these types of workflows and service lines throughout the industry itself. I think it's a great example, but we're starting to see other examples which aren't necessarily from federal sector itself promulgate throughout the industry overall. So, I think it's very important. It's, going to provide a substrate of data, and understanding about how the regulations need to come into play here. The FDA is an important stakeholder in that space itself at a time when I think 1 out of 4 approved submissions from the FDA are all related to precision medicine and personalized therapies themselves. So, it does allow the regulatory organizations to look at what happens when you start to aggregate, this type and this level of data for the patients, and then how do industry stakeholders use that. So even further proof points for regulatory organizations in terms of how they have to evolve their strategies going forward.
So I think, Fred, you made a great point. I think that this that the federal effort was able to shine a light on approaches that were being developed already in a lot of corners of academia and life sciences world, and it was able to attract a lot of attention and a lot of dollars, which I think is fantastic. I think even in the last 2 years, let alone the last 5 years, we talked about the democratization of data has allowed, as you were saying, Fred, I mean, this is something that maybe, 10 years ago we would have had to rely on a federal entity because of the vast amount of data storage that was required, the cost of storing that data, the expertise of being able to manipulate that data to do advanced analytics. That was all very difficult to come by. Now, if you think about what's happened in terms of the cost of data storage, the rapid ascent of cloud computing, the service-driven IT world that's come up with analytics as a service and data scientists as services, then you start to really you create an accessible environment where people can start to do these things without a gazillion dollars, where you can stand up a cloud environment, lease data scientists. We talked about the vendor community that's evolving quickly around this. Pair up with a couple vendors, and you have the ability now to do something that was inaccessible 5 to 7 years ago, much more so now. And if you think about the next 1 to 2 years, that's even going to bring even more approachability to the resources that would be required to run a program like this. So I think the government program is fantastic at shining a light on what's possible. I think the advances in information technology and analytics and the democratization of those resources is making this very accessible, and that's why we're seeing people start to move into this very quickly.
Yeah, well said, and I think it will be fascinating to continue to see how this progresses. Next one from the audience: are healthcare organizations, from your perspective, willing to pay for tools that aid precision medicine? Also, with some healthcare organizations that have limited resources, how can research in precision medicine be funded for them?
So on the first point, are they willing to pay for tools? I think categorically the answer is yes. However, the real bigger question is, okay, what are we getting ourselves into, i.e., what's going to be the full level of investments that we have to be considering related to stand-up precision medicine service lines as we define them. Now, often what happens is when they go through that exercise, they realize that, we actually either already have capabilities and tools and they just need to be repositioned in some capacity. For example, there was a couple capabilities that I had mentioned related to an enterprise data warehouse, or research data warehouse, et cetera. These are existing tools, and likewise on the transactional side, that again can be repurposed as part of the machinery itself. Where there's net new solutioning that is required, just as long as they understand the broader picture of the why they're investing in this, the support for the precision medicine strategy, and what their options are, and then give me the whole all-in story and figure. That's really where the kind of the critical question is overall. The second part of the question, I'm sorry, Rajiv, if you could iterate that, and then Bill, maybe you want to chime in first. That'd be great.
Sure. Second part of the question was for those organizations that have limited funding or limited resources, how can they get funding for precision medicine research?
Yeah, so I'll start with a quick response on that. So if, and I'm going to read into that question and assume that, look, it's an organization that historically hasn't, built up a research enterprise going forward. But, again, that doesn't mean that you have to dial that part of your precision medicine strategy down. Because of the currency of data at this point, there are many ways for those types of organizations that are more focused on care delivery, if you will, to participate in the research discovery and the drug development perspectives. And that's really critical where your network of networks comes into play. So there's existing data sharing efforts that they can participate in. Again, there are life sciences organizations that are actively investing in getting access to, in a controlled fashion, the appropriate type of data that they're looking for overall. So it's a matter of really informing if you want to really rev up a research discovery component of your precision medicine strategy. There are multiple options, and here is what they mean and the implications of those going forward. So, again, you don't have to set the phaser to stun here. You can actually consider all, those options going forward.
Great. Well, that is all the questions we have for today. But I would like to once again thank Dr. Fred Lee and Dr. Bill Farah for an excellent webinar presentation. And of course, I'd like to also thank our sponsor, Deloitte, for making today's program possible. Finally, I want to thank everyone in our audience for joining us today. We really hope you will join us in the future as well for another healthcare informatics webinar. This concludes today's presentation.